Okay, so there's this one particular part of the process of getting hired as a writer or narrative designer for video games that I literally never see discussed outside of professional circles. So, let's talk about writing tests, what they are, their purpose, tips and tricks for doing them, and the like. If you stick around to the end, I've even created my own example writing test if you'd like to give it a try or have some practice. So stay tuned for that. But before we get started, if you're new here, hi, I'm Anna. I'm a freelance writer and narrative designer in the games industry with over 6 years of experience, which is terrifying to say out loud and I don't want to think about it. I've even won some awards, so, you know, I'm legit, I guess. I've written for the tiniest of indies to the biggest of AAA, so trust me when I say I've done a lot of writing tests. You will never escape death, taxes, and writing tests. In fact, as a freelance writer, I'm frequently in the interview and writing test stages of talking to various studios, if I'm not in a dry spell, that is, which is normal and happens from time to time. Don't worry if you're a freelancer watching this. So if you're like me, you get desensitized to these kinds of things really quickly. But if you're used to working under the staff writer at a studio system, you might not encounter these as much, except when you're looking for your next gig. So whether you're an industry hopeful looking for information on writing tests, like I was over 6 years ago, an industry professional trying to get better at them, or you're a player and you're merely interested in this unique step in the process of making video games, you're in the right spot. So let's get started. Even though you've already submitted a portfolio and resume, it's normal to get a test somewhere within your interview process. And yes, this is often the case regardless of if you're an indie or AAA. As I said, death, taxes, and writing tests. Often, these come after your first round or two of interviews. With AAAs, it's often right after the recruiter screening, which is the traditional first step in the hiring process. But with indies, it can be anywhere. Receiving a writing test is basically the studio saying, okay, you look like you might be a good match for a particular listing based on your resume, portfolio, and you didn't seem like a jerk when we first talked to you, so let's see what you can really do. The studio will likely send you a document asking for a particular task to be completed. Depending on the studio's style or the particular needs of a project, it varies on what that particular task might be. For example, a studio like Obsidian is definitely going to be more likely to ask you for a branching conversation, whereas a big AAA like Insomniac might ask you to write a cinematic, which is what game devs just call cutscenes. They might have a specific request in terms of format, such as, please write us a cinematic screenplay format, or design us a branching conversation in a Word document. That's what game studios sound like. They'll usually provide you with whatever contextual information you would need to complete this, such as the setting, what the conversation should cover, who the characters are and what they're like, etc. Now, here's the kicker. There's often something very unusual about the task contained in the writing test. For example, they might have a ton of information that needs to be exchanged between characters, but they might give you a teeny line count or page number count to work with. This is intentional, as they're trying to see how well you can work, often under completely arbitrary restraints, which is basically the entire job of being a game writer. You have to be able to work around constraints often decided by other departments, such as, we only have this much budget for voiceover, so you have to get really creative with the few lines you do have to work with. They're intentionally giving you a tall order to see what you can creatively do with it. This is a test, after all, so just try your best. Most places are also totally cool with you asking follow-up questions if you need clarity on anything within the prompt as well. In my experience, they usually give you around a week to complete a test. Sometimes they'll tell you how long they expect it to take, such as, this will likely take about 4 hours of your time. And to be honest, anything more than that in terms of expectations should ring some alarm bells, because what they're essentially asking you for is unpaid labor. There's a lot of professional discourse regarding whether writing tests should be paid or not, and as a dedicated union girly, I'm of the belief that they absolutely should be, even if it's just a flat rate honorarium to show that they respect your time and labor as a candidate. But with that said, I've only ever been offered payment for a handful of the many writing tests I've done in my career, and it's almost always from indies. Funny how that happens. But I bring up the 4 hours thing because I want to put this bee in your proverbial bonnet. If something seems like it's going to take an unreasonably large amount of time or effort, be wary. The longest writing test I've ever taken for a studio that will remain unnamed, don't ask, was 16 pages in total upon completion. That's crazy. And I didn't even didn't get the gig. Looking back, I want to be like, no, Anna, don't do it. However, at the time, I was just laid off from my first staff job as a writer, and I was pretty desperate to get employment again as I lived in a pretty expensive city. So I understand I'm speaking from a place of privilege to insinuate that you might be in a position to turn down an offered writing test if it asks too much of you, but it's genuinely unreasonable how much some of these writing tests ask of their takers, especially in a labor market like it is at time of writing. So just give it a thought. But as I said, they often give you a week. Sometimes they'll ask you to look it over and let them know when you can get it back to them instead, as they often want to be sensitive to the fact that you might already be fully employed and have a family and might be working on this in the few moments of rest you would otherwise have had. But here's a tip from a second generation freelancer, okay? I learned this one from my dad, and it's now getting passed along to you all for free. Ready? If you take a look at what a writing test is asking and you think you can get it done by Wednesday, tell them you'll get it back to them on Friday. Then actually do get it done by Wednesday, but let it sit and marinate, maybe noodle with it a little bit, polish it up, and then send it to them on Thursday. This allows you some extra time to make sure you're really happy with your work without feeling rushed, and it makes you look professional when you turn it in technically early. They don't have to know you were already done. I'm going to use this as a segue to talk about some other tips, tricks, and personal best practices I've found for writing tests. So feel free to take these with a little bit of salt and take what works for you and leave what doesn't, okay? A writing test is a perfect example of trying to achieve balance in what's called voice. I'd love to make a whole video about finding your voice in writing at a later date, but when it comes to showing that you can write for a studio, you often want to be able to tone match or voice match the style of a studio's previous works. So if you're applying to a long-standing company and you're not very familiar with their style, or they ask you to do a writing test in the style of one of their previous games that you haven't played, it might behoove you to go watch some cutscenes on YouTube or poke around in a fan wiki to do some recon. You want to show that you can fit right into a narrative team. However, it's also important to be able to do so while retaining certain elements of your personal voice. A voice is basically the way you sound on paper. If someone reads your writing and says, well, that sounds like Anna, for example, that's voice. Everyone's voice is different and unique, and a writing room for a video game needs to both have a cohesive voice, like a choir composed of multiple voices that are unique but still play well together. So being able to tone match the studio while not just sounding like a copy-paste of their work and still sounding like you is a sophisticated part of the task. And as I said, it's pretty nebulous, but once you get into writing professionally, these are the kinds of things you need to focus on. So I might make a video about that at some point. Me being me, of course, I'm a bit of a punk rocker when it comes to my writing style, so for each writing test, I like to do what I call the one risky thing strat. Basically, I try to find one way within the test I've been given to really push the envelope, whether that's leaning into an unexpected aspect of the setting, or adding a specific feature, or a bit of narrative design, for lack of a better term. I always want to see what I can get away with, because that's me. I'm always going to be seeing how we can push the envelope narratively when I'm on the job. So this is like my little writing test for them. I want to see how they respond to it. However, just because this is how I roll doesn't mean that's how you roll, because honestly, some studios love my approach, others not so much. But again, me being me, I'm not sure I'd enjoy working at that kind of studio anyway. Maybe you really pride yourself on being able to deliver exactly what's being asked of you, and that works too. But this strat has personally felt true to me and has helped my application stand out, but your mileage may vary with this. Seriously. Keep in mind that writing tests, much like writing and interviewing, is a skill. The more you do them, the less intimidating they become, and you get better at them. You get better at predicting what a certain ask might be looking for between the lines, so you can give it your best shot. Of course, it's always a bummer when a test you really liked doesn't end up allowing you to progress for whatever reason. Some studios are able to provide feedback should you request it, which can help you identify weaker areas that you might need to work on or keep in mind for future tests down the line. However, please know that this is not a given. A lot of times, especially these days when there's a lot of people out there who have done the tests and are looking for work, studios just don't have the time to provide individual feedback for each writer. So just know that if they can't provide feedback or decline your request, it's nothing personal. You can always ask for feedback from your peers or any industry mentors you might have as well to see what they say. So all is not lost. But sometimes when you get turned down from a project once you've hit the writing test stage, you might get hit with the, your work was fantastic, it just wasn't what we're looking for. This is not super uncommon as you continue to get more skilled at your craft. In this case, getting turned down for the job isn't as much of a bummer because it often comes down to those intangible aspects of the job. For example, was your voice just not what they were looking for? Was the composition of the writer's room looking for something else, like a different style or someone who really excels at a particular area of writing? It's one of the unfortunate realities of the job that you could still do a really good job on a test and not get the gig due to circumstances entirely outside of your control. But that's showbiz, baby! In that case, you may find yourself parting ways with a studio opportunity for now, in the understanding that if something is a better fit in the future, they might reach back out. And sometimes they do. But if you've got a writing test that you're really proud of and you don't want it to just rot in your Google Drive for all of eternity, there's some things you can do with it. Obviously, if it contains any proprietary information related to any signed non-disclosure agreements, that might be a no-go. However, there's always another option, what game writers sometimes refer to as filing the serial numbers off. This is usually done for the purpose of including a writing test in your portfolio as an example of your work. Doing this involves removing any identifying information from the test itself, such as the studio you were writing it for, what the task specifically was, etc. If it's set in the world of an IP, you also might want to edit the document to make it more generic or like an off-brand version of the IP. However, sometimes this is harder than others. Your mileage may vary with this, but I do know some people who have successfully found work from a portfolio that contains a piece that was originally a writing test for somewhere else, just with the serial numbers filed off. Writing tests are a labor of love and can be a somewhat tedious step in the employment process of becoming a game writer. But learning how to not sweat them and building up your confidence just takes time and practice. So, by using an amalgamation of the typical things I remember seeing in all of the writing tests I've done over the years, I've written one for you! If you want to see what a writing test typically looks like, or you want to even give it a try, you're more than welcome to. I've given you a typical setup with some choices, a list of moments that are often referred to as beats, and dialogue components that need to be included. Oh, and a line limit. The link to the Google Doc of it will be in the description below, and you can select the Save a Copy option to make a copy to your own Google Drive, which will also allow you to directly edit right on the document if you'd like. I hope that this video was helpful or insightful or even just entertaining. Writing tests are a lesser known aspect of our job as a game writer, so I hope this sheds some light on one of the many hoops we game devs are expected to jump through before even being able to get hired. It's crazy out there. And of course, if there's a topic you'd like to see me cover, or if you have any specific writing test related questions, feel free to comment below. And thank you so much for watching. See, I didn't explode your eardrums this time. Bye!